Hi everyone, welcome to week 2 of flexible grouping. Last week I had you doing some reading and doing some watching of different styles of flexible grouping and what it can be used for. So just a brief review. Whenever you're grouping kids, remember there are many ways to do it. One is to keep the whole group. There's no reason not to have frontal pieces of your classroom. If you follow the workshop model of teaching, it always involves somewhat of a frontal piece of the lesson. One bit of advice that I've been giving teachers lately is to always, if you're going to be teaching frontally, somehow keep an eye on the time, whether you have your timer on your phone or a timer on your desk or just following the wall clock, whatever it is. You don't want to be the center of attention for too long. So sometimes I've turned that on and at 7 minutes on the dot, even if I'm mid-sentence, I stop talking and check for understanding. These pieces are very important. You can go on and on teaching. It's almost like filibustering. And while you think your students are completely vested and engaged, chances are you lost them about 10 minutes ago. So keeping track as you're teaching in the whole group situation of how much time has gone by, strategically placing those frontal lesson pieces throughout the lesson, but not for a long amount of time, will really help you in terms of keeping your students vested and focused. You can group them in small groups of same ability, small groups of mixed ability. In this week's lesson, there's an article about keeping them at the positives and negatives of same ability and mixed ability grouping, and how much student input should have in when you make your decisions about how you're going to group your students. Of course, you can group them in pairs and partners. And of course, there's a time for one-on-one. As you're getting ready to group your students, ask yourself the following questions. What is the goal of the lesson? This is very important. Being proactive in how you teach affects not only grouping, but affects the entire teaching piece that you're doing every single day. Going on the fly works occasionally, but the best lessons are the ones that you've proactively planned for, so you're not finding yourself rushing out to Xerox something, having to group kids on the fly. Everything should be pre-planned and organized. How will the students be grouped? Will they be grouped according to ability? Will they be grouped according to interest? Will they be grouped according to learning style? Will they be able to make their own groups? Will it be a project-based learning experiment? So you'll be reading about this week in your readings. You'll also be reading about how no matter how you group your students, you should think of them also as a team, and that every member of that team has a job and has accountability. It's not just go off and work in a group on the same worksheet, but everybody should have a job and a sense of purpose for what they're doing. How can the teacher ensure that groups work effectively? You're going to see another slide in a few minutes that's going to say training, training, training. You have to train yourself and your students how to work in a group. This is not going to happen overnight. It requires setting norms within the groups, setting plans within the groups, and being very proactive. Nobody is saying that you have to group your students every single day, but when you do, make sure there's an rhyme and a reason to it and you're transparent with it. How can the teacher maximize his or her role during independent or group work time? Once you've established group norms and you're pretty sure that kids can work in a group for about 5 to 7 minutes, what are you going to do during that time? This isn't the time to check your email or check your voicemail or check any kind of mail. This is a time for you to be proactively walking around, making sure your groups are on task and on target, following the norms that they've set, or taking a small group, or working one-on-one. This time that you have while the other kids are occupied with meaningful work should be something that you pre-plan as well, and pre-plan with whom you're going to be working. You want to make sure that you have meaningful activities for all students. Remember that you can differentiate the content, the process, and the product. Taking all of these into consideration as you plan your lessons and plan your learner outcomes is very important. Teachers often ask me when I'm working in groups and I'm working with one of the small groups, what are my other students doing? Remember from last week the slide of the stadium. You don't want to be stadium teaching. You don't want to be putting out fires. You don't want to be playing whack-a-mole with the kids, looking up constantly, seeing if somebody needs help, if somebody's not on task. You want to make sure that if you're working with one student or 5 students in a small group, your other students are actively engaged. Here are 3 things that you can do with them. One is anchor activities, the second is tiered activities, and the third is generic worksheets. What are anchor activities? Anchor activities are ongoing long-term assignments that are directly related to the curriculum and are worked on throughout a unit or the semester. They are worked on independently in the classroom and not at home. It's not busy work, again, related completely to what you're teaching during that class time. Or even Dr. Goldberg has mentioned, it doesn't have to be during the same medium. It doesn't have to be during the same subject area, I should say. They could be working on an anchor activity from Navi class in your Chumash class, or in your Gemara class, or in your Ivrit class. However, but as long as you know the rubrics and the constraints for the activities, and that the kids understand what it is they're supposed to do, they can work independently. I used to use these sometimes as bonus work and graded work. It was a great way for me to see whether kids were able to make connections. What are the benefits? It obviates the need to plan new activities every night. An anchor activity should be a sustained activity to be worked on multiple times during the week for a good week, 2 weeks, or 3. Planning does not become overwhelming. Once you've created an anchor activity or generic form of an anchor activity, you can use it over and over again, changing the content. It frees up the classroom teacher to work with small groups of students or individuals. These anchor activities, again, I cannot emphasize this enough, should not be busy work. I had a colleague who called doing a class puzzle, she considered that to be an anchor activity. That is not an anchor activity. That is something that they can do as an option when they're done with their work. Again, an anchor activity is something that is steeped into your curriculum outline, testing and checking for feedback and understanding of what the new material. Anchor activities give students the opportunity to be creative and explore a subject that they are interested in. When I was teaching second grade Ivrit, second grade Hebrew, we were learning about weather and related clothing. My anchor activity for that unit was creating an LL Bean catalog where the kids had to describe to me what objects they were selling, what colors it came in, what sizes it came in, and what the price was. With this project that took about 2 weeks to do, they could keep building it. They could spend a lot of time on one area. If they wanted to spend time on describing the sweater, or describing the shirt, or describing the boots, that would be great. If they wanted to spend time creating beautiful pictures, fantastic. Whatever it was, to check for understanding, to make sure that I had taught them well. Anchor activities are always available for students to work on. If they're finished with an activity, they can go to the anchor activity. Some teachers use it as if they're working with one group, the second group is working on the new material from that day, and the third group can be working on the anchor activities. Some people say, but what about the lowest level of learner in the class? So oftentimes it would be beneficial to me if I started off the group time and said to my lower level kids, today I'm going to be reading with group A or group C, however you want to call it. You guys are going to start with your anchor activities. So because the anchor activity is not busy work, because it is checking for understanding on the new material and on the material of the new unit and the unit itself, it never was busy work. It was always checking for understanding and assessing. Here are some examples of anchor activities. Creating a timeline, creating biography, Torah cards or history cards. This one was my favorite. Using the example of a baseball card, creating a baseball card for Noah, for example. What are things that you would learn from the text? And what are things that could be considered midrash that you know about Noah? Creating a children's book, writing a journal, a halachic guide, a newspaper. Any of these would be carrots for the kids to go for. Using the example of working as a team, if the kids were working on a newspaper together, it would still be independent work, but they would work as a team to produce the newspaper. Every person in the group would be responsible for a different section of that newspaper. Setting the norms within that group would help you to be able to see who is pulling their weight and who is not getting enough time to work on their project. When you're using anchor activities to create groups, you can teach the whole class to work independently and quietly on an anchor activity. Half of the class is working on the anchor activity, and half of the class is working with a teacher with direct instruction, or a third on the anchor activity, a third on a different activity related to that day's topic, and a third working with a teacher. Again, training the kids how to get in and out of groups, what are the materials they're going to need in order to complete each of the activities. All these pieces need to be trained and learned by your students. Make no assumptions. Creating a classroom community, a classroom culture where working in a group is encouraged, where working in a group does not mean that you can slack off, quite the opposite. Everybody should be vocal in what they're responsible in completing and responsible for in the group. Tiered activities. Teachers should allow for a range of levels of student skills and abilities in their design of activities. While maintaining a focus on the big ideas, major concepts, a teacher may tier assignments in order to allow each student to perform an assignment suited to his or her skill level. So taking one lesson, for example, I had a colleague once who was teaching Tohu Vavohu, chaos, at the very beginning of Breshit, of Genesis. She wanted them all to understand what feel have the understanding of what tohu vavohu may have been. Not everybody, though, was going to be happy about doing an art project. So her frontal lesson was about the first psukim of Breshit, in which first there was tohu vavohu, and then Hashem started to put order in the world. The learner outcome was for the kids to understand what did tohu vavohu look like. She tiered the activities in 2 ways according to learning styles. For one, she had them write a newspaper article describing what they would have seen if they would have witnessed what tohu vavohu was. The second group created an art project, much more visual in nature, much more hands-on in nature, in which they took scraps of paper to represent what tohu vavohu was. In each instance, they had to quote directly from the text to make sure that the teacher had taught properly where the verse is found in the Torah and how tohu vavohu was represented in the Torah and then represented in their own work. So if everybody was to learn, if we're looking at this grid right now, at this slide right now, the on-level task, that would be one way that you could tier. Another would be in terms of being on level, above level, or below level. Taking the same concept of tohu vavohu, explaining if you're on level, explaining it, showing the pasuk in Hebrew and maybe translating it into English. Above level, you would be only speaking in Hebrew, using descriptive words. And below level, maybe you would take the same pasuk and use a description in English. Generic worksheets. Generic worksheets are worksheets whose instructions stay the same even though the material being studied changes. Once students learn how to complete the assignment, they can repeat the same process with whatever information is presented to them. This encourages children to be independent, and you don't have to keep creating new activities as the blank worksheet remains the same while the content might change. Here are some examples for Reader Translator, Summarizer, and Daily Review. If you want those worksheets, just email me and I will email you the PowerPoint. As you're grouping students, you always want to make sure you're assessing them to make sure that they're in the right group. That doesn't mean in terms that you always want to make sure before you start a new unit, give them a KWR, know, want to know, and learn chart to fill out. Give them a mind map to fill out of everything they can tell you about the topic. You might be surprised that by switching topics, kids that didn't have a lot of prior knowledge for the previous topic might have a lot of knowledge on the topic moving forward. So always giving them a quick 5-minute assessment to see where they are and where they want to go will help you in your grouping. Having classroom discussion, worksheets, homework assignments, individual reflection, exit cards, entrance cards, any of these tools will help you to assess who should go with which group. Of course, it's important to get feedback from everybody, but it's especially important to get feedback from your students. This will help you to design next steps, next action steps in terms of tiering activities, creating generic worksheets, or designing anchor activities. Of course, how are you going to make this all work? You're going to practice, practice, practice. Getting into groups, getting out of groups, creating norms, making sure that conversations are happening, making sure they're working as a team and not just individuals as a group, making sure that their responsibilities are clearly denoted. Make sure that within the classroom, although it might seem like organized chaos, the key word there is organized, and make sure that their voice levels allow for even the quietest of students to be able to perform. Make sure that as the kids go off to work in their groups, everybody's jobs are clearly defined. Every student knows what his or her responsibility is. And be flexible. When you have flexibility, when you come into the classroom and you realize this isn't going to work, these groups aren't fluid enough, or these kids learn everything overnight, I need to be flexible. Students must learn the skills necessary to be successful in different situations, as a whole class, as part of a group, as an individual. As we teach these 21st century students, we need to keep those C's very much in the forefront of our minds. How can we encourage them to be creative in their expressions? How can we encourage them in the expression of what they can know, understand, and do with the information? How can we help them to work collaboratively so that they're a member of a team? How can we help them to become critical thinkers, taking information in and making it their own? The grouping strategies will help your students to find their own voices in how they learn and will be able to help you create meaningful experiences for your students. So enjoy this work. Don't hesitate to reach out with any questions or concerns. Shabbat Shalom. Take care.